I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Timothy Ash and Tetyana Nesterchuk. And this is on an absolutely pivotal time where, of course, everyone is having their email and their social media feeds absolutely spammed by this so-called peace negotiation process and what seems to be a process of briefing from multiple sides, mass confusion and acrimony. That may, in fact, be the Russian point of injecting these narratives into our diplomatic and political sphere, but we're going to tackle that. Timothy Ash has been a professional economist for more than 30 years, with two-thirds of that in the banking industry. He is a vocal advocate for Ukraine, for its victory, and for rule of law. He writes, has written and given interviews to places like Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, etc. And he has an absolutely extraordinary Substack which cuts through all the noise. We'll put a link in the description. You really do have to check that out and subscribe to it. Tetyana Nesterchuk is a barrister and arbiter at Fountains Court Chambers. She is a UK expert at the Council of Bars and Law Societies of Europe and a vocal Ukrainian in London. She is doing whatever she has in her power to support Ukraine's fight, and especially from a legal and financial standpoint. But for her, the war didn't start in 2022, when, unfortunately for many of us, that's when it got onto our radar. This war began in 2014 when her hometown of Donetsk was overtaken by Russian-backed separatists. Now, let's jump into the discussion. I don't know who wants to jump in first, but of course, the news broke, or rather the news was leaked of the peace plan, and now it seems we have counter briefings by various people. What is your impression? Well, let's start with Timothy, because you've written a Substack piece on this already. Is this a peace plan? Is it a vehicle for psychological warfare? Is it an attempt to divide, confuse, distract? And is it, as on the more hawkish side, people are saying, a plan for Ukraine's capitulation and surrender?
Well, I'm afraid I kind of think the latter. I mean, it's a bit extraordinary where it's come from. We don't kind of know. There seems to have been a process between Witkoff and Dmitriev, Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's advisor, over the last month. Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian National Security Council chief, seems to be involved in that process as well. The Europeans weren't, which is kind of interesting. They seem to have been taken aback by it. I mean, reading it looks, a peace deal very much on Russia's terms. I find it very difficult to imagine that a Ukrainian leader could accept this and survive in office. In the end, for Ukraine, whatever peace terms are agreed, they have to assure the survival and prospect for successful development of the country going forward, right? And security is key to that. This document seems to suggest that Ukraine de facto will accept the loss of territory, Crimea, Donbass, and Luhansk, and conceding, giving up additional territory in Donbass. The security guarantees still are pretty weak in my mind. That's the key for the country to go forward. And it looks, I guess it looks like Europe's been undermined and have the carpet pulled out from under it yet again by the Trump administration. I mean, there are different interpretations. Tatiana may have a different view, but it looks like the Trump administration wants to change the news cycle again. Obviously, it's in difficulty domestically. Trump's popularity ratings are pretty low. There's the Epstein stuff going on in the background. And it's worrying that the Americans seem to want to get this done very quickly, right? I'm sure Ukraine, wants to try and renegotiate lots of this document. I'm not sure, a week's time or so before Thanksgiving will give them the ability to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what the Europeans come up with. Obviously, they're on the plane or they're in Johannesburg at G20. I understand European leaders have been pulled out of meetings to talk to Trump around this sort of agenda. I guess, look, in the end, we seem to be back to where we were in February, with the Trump administration working on its own agenda in its own interests, seeming to put Russia's interests above Ukraine. So the question now is, what agency does Ukraine have to pull back from all this? I don't know, but disappointing, I guess, for Ukraine ultimately.
And Tatiana, the angle I wanted to fire at you is that this has a horrible whiff of sort of Groundhog Day or deja vu about it, because it seems that many of the clauses in here are maximalist. Many of them actually we've seen before. It's a rehash, recooked version that's been attempted multiple times, and in fact, only a few weeks ago was flatly dismissed by Marco Rubio as being unworkable and unrealistic in a sort of uncharacteristic incident of him seeming to have a spine. It's now being put around, and this may be counter briefing, that he had a hand in drafting this. It seems to be not just a process of an internal communications war between two factions within the Trump regime, and the announcement that Kellogg is departing, maybe telling us who is actually coming to the fore on that. But this, I don't know your view here. Does this have a whiff of a Kremlin psychological operation? Because the way this is being presented, the way it's being sort of rammed through, it's being presented as a reality when it's not, as a done deal when it's absolutely not. And it's presenting Ukrainian defeat and weakness as an inevitability. Well, this is very much aligned with Kremlin information operations and how their psychological warfare typically plays out.
I mean, I would agree with your assessment, Jonathan. I cannot take this plan seriously because I don't see what has changed other than perhaps Trump would want to have something, a different news cycle, as Tim says. But frankly, the demands here are, as apparently an anonymous US source said, is sort of the typical Kremlin maximalist fantasy. And so those were rejected and not acceptable in February. They were still not acceptable, as you say, a couple of weeks ago. So I can't see these demands being acceptable now because nothing has changed. In fact, I would say Ukraine is in a much stronger position now because, of course, as a result of the oil sanctions imposed by US and Russia, Russia's economy is suffering, despite the pictures that they would like to present to the world. And, that is also part of the Kremlin propaganda machine. Their economy is suffering. And so it is definitely in Russia's interest to propose some sort of peace deal. Zelensky will never be able to agree to effectively cede 20% of Ukrainian territory, including, as Tim said, the territories which Russia have not been able to gain militarily. Quite significant lands in Donetsk and Luhansk, so my homeland, which Russia has not yet taken. So I can't see Ukraine simply ceding those, and also ceding Zaporizhia and Kherson, given the campaign to take those back. But it's interesting to see. I mean, for me, this is very much a Russian document. I can't imagine that anybody in the US, possibly apart from Witkoff, who has always been reported to kind of not really know his way around the Russo-Ukrainian relations, and being taken in by the Russian propaganda, famously going into a meeting with Putin without a note taker, and then misreporting what was said at that meeting. So possibly Witkoff had a hand in this. Definitely not Rubio, definitely not Lavrov. Those negotiations broke down. But it is interesting to see what it says when it comes to sort of the economic stuff, apart from, everything else that, all claims have to be abandoned, etc. There is this acceptance that 100 billion or the frozen state assets have to be handed over to Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine. Now, 100 billion is a drop in the ocean given the devastation of Ukraine so far. But still, I mean, we are still in Europe trying to find ways to fund Ukraine. There is, as we know, in Europe itself, there's close to 200 billion euros in cash sitting in Belgium, in various bank accounts of Euroclear, which could be available to fund Ukraine. And here it is, a Russian document, very clearly a Russian document, accepting tacitly that 100 billion could be given to Ukraine to reconstruct and rebuild. Why are we still worrying about handing this money over to Ukraine? Even Russia seems to accept that they've got to pay something. But what is also interesting about this document is that it also says that the profits whatever profits you can make from rebuilding a broken country. But the profits, apparently 50% of those will go to US. So that's very interesting. US seems to think that this money, which it doesn't hold, US holds only about 5 billion of the entirety of the frozen state assets of the Russian Federation. US seems to think that it can bargain with this money. It treats it as its own fund, frankly, and make
Well, it feels like
profits.
an admin fee that a real estate mogul
Yeah.
might impose on a client.
Well, why not? We help to a brokerage fee. We help to broker this, so we get to keep some of the profits. So unless Europe stands up and starts leading, US will be continuing, and we will see that the funding that's available right now in Europe, and the fate of Ukraine that can be, and the fate of Europe, frankly, that can be decided right here by European leaders, is being literally pulled out of them and handed over to Trump and Putin simply through indecision.
And this is the point I wanted to put to both of you, actually, because we often get this narrative like, America is tired of war and tired of this and tired of that and etc. And it's going to pull the plug. In reality, Ukraine's survival at this point, militarily and indeed much of the sort of social costs are being footed by Europe, not by the US at all. And yet it seems that their sort of agency in this process is entirely denied. In fact, Ukraine's agency in the process has been denied as well. So the idea that the document talks about Ukrainian sovereignty while denying them sovereignty in the very process of drafting this is of course ludicrous. But Timothy, what's going on here? Is Europe just going to sit and be outraged on the sidelines? And does its financial commitment to Ukraine really count for nothing in these processes?
Well, I guess we're going to have to hope that Alex Stubb uses his golf skills to great effect to have influence on President Trump to pull him back from this document. It appears to me, I mean, maybe the US administration is, I mean, just going back a little bit to what Tatiana said, it looks like there are different tensions, fissures, whatever, within the Trump administration, right? I mean, it does seem like a group within the Trump administration, I think probably including Trump himself, are trying to force this deal on Ukraine. I mean, Secretary of the Army Driscoll was in Kiev over the last couple of days. It looks like he revealed the terms of this deal to President Zelensky. So, I think Trump does want this deal. I think he thinks, I would possibly push back a little bit on what Tatiana said. I mean, I think there's a bit of opportunism here, right? I mean, there's a feeling perhaps in the Trump administration and maybe in Moscow that the Energoatom scandal, the Pokrovsk situation has weakened Zelensky, made him vulnerable, and made him more willing to deal and accept an unpalatable deal. So I think there's a bit of that going on. Opportunism from the Trump administration. Opportunism and profiteering, as Tetyana said, right? I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really, to think about it, that, Ukraine that's, suffered probably hundreds of thousands of casualties in this war is being charged for defending Europe and European values, right? I mean, I just find it unbelievable that a US administration, the leader of the free world, can do that when Ukraine is obviously fighting for freedom. In terms of the Europeans, as you rightly said, I mean, they're on the line for the 100 billion a year annual bill for supporting Ukraine. They are writing checks. They have been since the Trump administration assumed office. The harsh reality, though, is that Europe, because of its failures over the last 30 years, its focus on EU enlargement and less on its own security, means that it is still dependent on the US for weapons and munitions and ultimately the security backstop, right? And yes, suddenly Europe has kind of figured it out that the US is not necessarily a reliable partner and it needs to have its own independent military capability to be able to defend itself. It's going to take a very long time to do that, right? And the irony really is that Ukraine, the longer Ukraine can hold out, it's a front line obviously against Russian aggression anyway, but it buys Europe time to put that independent military capability in place, right? I mean, it will take 4 to 5 years, I guess, for all this investment we're seeing in European defence to come to fruition to the point that realistically it could actually defend itself without significant support from the Americans, right? I mean, and again, the Ukrainians are frontline there and they are helping Europe, but we are in a desperately difficult position, right? And Trump is exploiting that, I think, and Putin is playing Trump, as we all know, full and well, and it's all pretty unfortunate. And Ukrainians continue to pay the ultimate price in terms of their own blood, unfortunately.
And as Ben Hodges often says on this channel and many others, that war is about logistics and it's about will. It seems that at this point we have a severe test of will, and this is a question for Tetyana here. There are points in history where we look back and we realize that actually the winning side was far weaker than people knew at the time. And in fact, history could have gone a very different way. One example would be the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, where it turned out the Japanese were very close to absolute defeat and capitulation there, but one side loses their nerve. The other one, I think, in the Second World War, famously is a sort of siege of Singapore, possibly, but where a British general or whatever decided to throw in the can, not realizing that the Japanese had almost run out of equipment and so on. I need to get my history better because that sounded very vague and someone's going to take me up on that in the comments. But are we seeing the same thing here? We know that there are certain issues with recruitment. We know there are issues with manpower in the infantry, but Ukraine seems to, in my view, have been strengthening in many respects, including the ability to strike long range at Russian infrastructure, including its oil industry. Is this maybe one of the reasons we're seeing this extraordinary pressure right now? Is it because Russia actually is far weaker and maybe even have a certain amount of realization of that?
Look, I think in this war there is an element of this being sort of the dying throes of a dying empire. Russia is so aggressive and so dangerous precisely because it is weak, and so it will do everything to make sure that the world doesn't see its weakness. But in terms of whether it will be able to get away with pushing through this sort of so-called peace plan, which is a capitulation plan for Ukraine. I mean, I can't imagine Europe ever accepting any of this. We have seen, so the moment that the news of this peace plan have broke out and nobody knew quite who leaked it and whose plan this was, and US were at that stage denying completely that they had anything to do with it. There was a debate here in the House of Lords, an urgent sort of 10-minute debate. And one of the questions was, is Russia going to be allowed to get away with its ill-gotten gains? Now, this plan, now that we have it and see it doesn't just let Russia get away with its ill-gotten gains in breach of international law. It rewards it. It rewards Russia, and it rewards US through the sharing of profits mechanism. Now, that is extraordinary. And what the government said in response to a question, is Russia going to be allowed to keep its ill-gotten gain? The government was very strong. It said Russia must not be rewarded for its actions here. That would send a bad signal to others around the world and would leave other states in the region incredibly vulnerable. And we know that this plan talks about expectation of Russia not going and invading Europe. But we also know that Russia is fully capable of running the sort of hybrid warfare that we have been seeing. So sending drones, which have mysteriously and en masse became suddenly incapable of operation and cross borders into countries where they should not have been, crossing into NATO territory. So scrambling internet systems, scrambling IT, doing all sorts of hybrid attacks on energy, on IT security. So Russia will continue doing that. it will not stop, no matter what whatever peace plan is being agreed. So I cannot see Europe at this stage accepting Ukraine effectively capitulating and weakening its army, which is part of this plan as well, without really any security guarantees at all, as Tim has said. So from my point of view, I think I will have to disagree with Tim. It may be that US is trying to take advantage of Ukraine right now because of the weakness of the president's position, but I can't see the president being able to accept this, at least without going to Ukrainian people for a referendum, precisely because he's in a weak position. You see, so I cannot see Ukraine accepting their president effectively relinquishing lands for which we have been dying for the last 3.5 years and giving them back to Russia with nothing at all being promised to Ukraine.
In fact, it would potentially put his political standing in an even more precarious position than it finds itself in this week, and even putting Yermak on the bonfire of political appeasement would probably not save him from such a decision as signing up to this.
Absolutely. I think he would sooner get rid of Yermak, which at the moment seems almost an impossibility, than agree to this peace plan. And I can't see Europe pushing Zelensky and Ukraine to agree to this.
Timothy, is Europe going to sort of sit back, or we're paying the bills here and we still seem to have a modicum of values? What form could the pushback from Europe take here? Because they're going to come under extraordinary pressure from the US, especially if it seems that Trump senses weakness and momentum. He's going to pile in. We know he will. He may be on the fence while he tries to sort of figure out which way the wind's blowing, but if he thinks he can get a win here, he will absolutely pile in. What can Europe do to push back? Are they still afraid, for instance, of trade tariffs, or is the tone changing in the US? It seems there's a High Court action later this year that may actually block Trump's tariff policies. So is he weakening? Can Europe stand up to him?
Well, interesting. I mean, I think Europe rolled over on tariffs earlier in the year because it understood its vulnerabilities on security. And I think the quid pro quo there, I guess, on the tariff front was the understanding that the Americans would continue to supply weapons to Ukraine and to Europe for cash, for payment, as long as Europe didn't make a big thing about the tariffs and didn't go down a retaliatory path. Europe could reopen that whole story. I mean, again, the threat from Russia, I mean, it's pretty clear now. European politicians really understanding now that Russia is an existential threat to the survival of Europe. I mean, I think it's clear now from Merz and Macron, and they get it finally. Too late, 3.5 years too late, perhaps, or even longer than that. But they do get it. How willing are they to make a stand on this issue, right? I would argue that this, if there's a cross for them to kind of die on, this is it. This is the existential battle. Ukraine, as I said, is the front line. Absolutely, now is the time to absolutely make it crystal clear to the Americans that if they value Europe as allies going forward, not just against Russia, or that's the wrong messaging around Trump, but against China, for example, then they really have to deliver this time around. I don't think Europe's been particularly good at selling its story to the Americans, particularly, right? They have leverage. I mean, they're huge. Europe is a huge economy, right? 27 trillion, euros total. And if the Americans think the ultimate battle is with China, Europe is now getting its defense spending and military industrial complex in order. Again, it will take 4 to 5 years to develop. But if the Americans are thinking somewhere down the line there's going to be there's a hegemonic battle with the Chinese militarily, they absolutely will need the Europeans by their side. And I think if the Americans don't stand up by our side this time around, then I don't think Europe should be there when the American knocks on the door about China, right? So, again, we will be spending huge amount of money on munitions going forward, and that's a huge market for the Americans again. I mean, much bigger. It's interesting that MBS was in the US this week, and he was talking about 140 billion odd of defense purchases from the Americans. I mean, Europe will be spending multiples of that. So again, we have to use our leverage, I think. I mean, maybe just going back a bit. I mean, in terms of this deal in particular. I mean, I'm sure Tatiana will agree with me. And I guess the problem in all this is that a fundamental lack of understanding of Putin by Trump and his team. Right? I don't think he kind of gets, how important Ukraine is to Putin. This deal. I mean, the problem for all of us is, this deal will be a transitory deal from Putin's perspective, right? We know he wants the whole of Ukraine, absolutely crystal clear, right? He doesn't. It's not just about Donbass. It's not just about Crimea. It was never about only those regions. He wants, he obviously wrote that essay in the middle of 21, just before the full-scale invasion, to provide justification for Russian troops that were going to go into Ukraine eventually. This is why the invasion happened, right? Because Putin wants the whole of Ukraine, right? So this deal is meant to be a bad deal because Putin knows it will politically, socially, and economically destabilize Ukraine, right? I mean, as Tetyana said, I mean, it'll be incredibly difficult for a Ukrainian president to sell this deal, giving up territory in exchange for very, very weak security assurances and no assurance that the Russians won't continue to undermine and destabilize Ukraine going forward, because that's what they want, right? I mean, I refer to the language that, I mean, we're getting new tidbits from this as we go along. I mean, I noticed Axios, Barak David is sending stuff out, and in the forward to the agreement, I note that the Americans say something like the United States affirms that a significant, deliberate, and sustained armed attack by Russian Federation across the agreed armistice line into Ukraine shall be regarded as an attack threatening the peace and security of the transatlantic community. In such an event, the President of the United States shall, in exercise of constitutional authority, and after immediate consultation of the Ukraine, NATO, and European partners, determine the measures necessary to restore security. These measures may include armed force, intelligence, and logistical assistance, economic and diplomatic actions, etc., etc. I think the key there is the terms used at the start, that a significant, deliberate, and sustained armed attack by the Russian Federation across the armistice line. I mean, so Russia can, after this peace is agreed, continue to attack Ukraine as long as it's not sustained and it's not that significant. I mean, what does that mean? So Russia continue to launch the occasional missile strike against Ukraine, and that will be acceptable for the Americans, right? I mean, look, in the end, if Ukraine is to successfully develop economically, it needs security, right? International business going into Ukraine need to know that Russia is not going to lob missiles here and there onto Ukrainian territory, and that statement from the Americans is not really strong enough in my mind, right? I mean, it needs to be cast iron, right? I mean, if Russia launches one missile, like we saw this week in Western Ukraine, that kills people, that should trigger the security assurance from the Americans. It's crystal clear. I mean, this document, this statement, is blurry. I mean, it's almost as blurry as the Budapest Memorandum that we know.
I would argue
worse even than Budapest in some ways. Michael Weiss certainly was commenting that he thought it was.
I mean, I would argue that even a single drone is bad enough. We don't have to wait for missiles. How many drones would it be acceptable for Russia to fly into Ukraine? How many people would it be acceptable to personally target via the so-called drone safari before the security guarantees kick in? I would say even a single drone trying to attack a single person is sufficient to activate the security guarantees. But turning back to sort of, Tim is right. I mean, we know, and the British government has openly said that they know that these territories, which the so-called peace deal agreed to hand over to Russia on behalf of Ukraine, is not Putin's aim. I mean, in March 2014, when Putin annexed Crimea illegally, in his speech, he said that Kyiv is the mother of all Russian cities. So he is not going to stop at Donbass, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia. His aim is Kyiv. We know this, but not just Kyiv. I mean, this is another thing. He has been, and again, on Wednesday in the debate, the government has admitted that they're well aware of Putin's expansionist behavior in Romania, Georgia, Poland. I mean, we're not stopping at Kyiv here. So Europe really needs to think about its leverage, as Tim said. And for me, the very clear leverage that we have right now, but which may not be there soon, is the frozen Russian assets. We are fighting a war of attrition in Ukraine. We are trying to bring down the Russian war machine, the funding that's sponsoring the Russian war machine, and agreeing to a peace deal now, which effectively hands to Russia 200 billion, is against everyone's interest. It is clearly against European interest. US here is acting as a broker, being paid for it, to frankly hand Europe and European peace and security over to Putin. And I cannot see Europe ever agreeing to this. I mean, I really have my strong suspicions that this peace deal will end up exactly where the previous had been, somewhere, in the bin and, in the back of the Internet Archive. But we shall see. A peace deal must be negotiated, but it's not going to look like this.
But might it wake Europe up? Because it seems clear something which perhaps Europeans, not even in their wildest nightmares, had thought would happen. They're saying, well, we can't hand over, this remaining sort of, $240 billion because Russia will sue us, because this, because that, and because our standing in the world, we need to be upstanding in terms of rule of law and demonstrate to the rest of the world. The US is flagrantly saying, we don't care about any of that stuff. That's very 20th century. We're way beyond that stuff. And now it's looking to get its hands on the little honeypot of Russian money in Europe. So not only do we have Russia that is blithely contemptuous of rule of law, we have the US as well. And they're both eyeing these funds. Europe should be worried that they're being caught in a pincer operation.
They should be. And I'm actually with Europe and European leaders that we have got to preserve the rule of law. We have got to act in accordance with law, because ultimately that's what this war in Ukraine is about. The war in Ukraine is a fight against a country that wants to live by the rules, the recognized rules that we accept in Europe, and a country that frankly has been ignoring those rules. Russia has been ignoring the rule of law and the human rights of its own citizens ever since its existence, in 1990. 1991, it just moved in 2008 and moved into Georgia. Other countries in 2014, it moved into Ukraine, and we're fighting against the breakdown of the established rule of law order. So I do believe we have to act in accordance with the rule of law. Where I don't agree with European leaders is that it is against the rule of law to confiscate Russian assets and use them to pay reparations, compensation to Ukraine, and frankly to use them to bolster Ukraine's defenses and European defenses as well. And the reason for that is that there is no total impunity for breaches of fundamental rules of international law. There isn't. The system of international law does have mechanisms to deal with breaches of international law. Now, those mechanisms cannot be enforced if the countries don't agree to be enforced. But there is a way, there's a self-help mechanism, the mechanism of countermeasures, which effectively says that you can do things which would ordinarily be unlawful in order to persuade somebody, to encourage somebody to act in accordance with the accepted principles and norms. So what we're seeing now is Russia acting for the last 11 years against all the principles of international law. And we have escalated in terms of financial sanctions, including by freezing these assets. And the next obvious step is obviously to take these assets and use them to support Ukraine. And that is not against the rule of law. In fact, it is in accordance with the rule of law, and possibly the only thing that Europe has been avoiding doing. Frankly, you could argue it's a duty when nothing else is working. If Ukraine is being pushed into the corner, if Ukraine and Europe are being pushed to accept a peace deal, which frankly is not in anyone's interest, then Ukraine has got to be supported and strong steps have to be taken. Difficult decisions have to be made. But that's why you do get into a position of power, you have to, it's your duty to make difficult decisions in accordance with the law. And where a legal path exists, and I strongly believe, and that's not just me, I mean, there's a huge amount of legal opinion on this by the most prominent international law academics. Where a legal path exists, I believe it is a duty of the leaders of the free world, as they call themselves, to take that path rather than force Ukraine to capitulate.
So it's not just lack of will, it's lack of duty and responsibility by leaders. And the challenge, of course, here comes where two members of the UN Security Council are actually entirely complicit in this invasion, China and Russia, and where the third is wobbling between sort of soft appeasement and hard appeasement of the aggressor. Timothy, this seems to come back to Europe. This is a make or break moment for Europe. If Europe steps in and says, no, this is contrary to our values, this is contrary to Europe and Ukraine's interest, and we are going to back this up by handing the funds over to Ukraine, by bolstering them with munitions, support, and pushback, this peace deal, as it were, or this peace farce will be dead in the water. But if Europe hangs back, waiting to see, the fog clearing, that's the space in which this, let's call it the Russian psychological operations and media manipulation, which are proceeding apace. Even while we're talking, there's more stuff coming out on their expert manipulation of the media narrative. If they step back and wait for the fog to clear, then that really is ceding the advantage to Russia.
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, Trump cares about money, clearly, right? And, if Europe did move quickly to confiscate the 200 billion-ish immobilized Russian assets in our jurisdiction and then committed to use that to buy weapons from the Americans, I don't think Trump would say no to that, right? In the end, Europe and Ukraine's problem is not money, or Europe's problem is not particularly the money. We can find solutions there. It's the equipment, right? And again, unfortunately, we're reliant on the Americans for the supply of that equipment. And I don't think Trump would be able to say no to a enormous arms procurement program. I mean, the 200 billion in immobilized Russian assets to be used to buy weapons for Europe and Ukraine, and then Europe's own defense procurement needs, which will inevitably, in the short to medium term, significantly rely on the Americans. So in the end, that's our leverage, I guess. Europe's use to the Americans as a expanding, growing military industrial complex, helping the Americans counter the threat from China going forward. But creating jobs in the US, right? And we have to absolutely move. I mean, if anything has sent a clear message to Europe, that we need to get our act together finally on the immobilized Russian assets in European jurisdictions, including the UK. I should say that this should be it, right? Why are we messing around? It's just extraordinary. Over 3.5 years since the first immobilization, right? And, we are still debating it, right? And, obviously the reparation loan suggestion is what Europe or the European Commission seems to have come up with. It's imperfect, right? There are better and easier things to do. Again, Tatiana and myself would say that, confiscation is the obvious and much easier thing to do. And again, the reparation loan, the Belgians have, put forward various problems with reparation loan idea. I can think of lots of solutions that would get around the Belgians' problems. And these solutions were suggested more than 3.5 years ago. I mean, it's a sad reflection of the lack of leadership in Europe that we are where we are now, and we're still talking about this issue when it should have been done, right? But anyway, there you go. At least the reparation loan idea, despite its drawbacks, in theory, could see the release of funds for Ukraine relatively quickly. If we get a decision at the European Council meeting on December the 19th, let's hope that does happen.
Well, I know your time is precious and we're running short on it. The sort of last question, this may be better to put to Kyiv, so I'm going to try and get on here because he's the expert, obviously, in weaponized Russian negotiation techniques. But The first thing that struck me in its absolute absence, well, there's sort of justice, which Tatiana has mentioned there as well, and actually in the draft that we just saw last night, there is some mention at least of kidnapped children, etc., that redresses. None of that, of course, is mentioned in the leaked version, which is the sort of the Russia narrative version that supposedly Dmitriev managed to put into the sphere. What struck me in almost all of the debate that's going on is how internally focused it is on the US and the US's actions, on Europe's actions. And, we've covered that here. No one is asking the very simple question, which we've asked many times on the channel before, which is, can Putin physically end the war? Or will that be too much of an existential threat to his regime? We already know from talking to various Russian commentators and dissidents, he absolutely cannot bring his rabble raping army back to Russia. He cannot have hundreds of thousands of psychopaths and traumatized soldiers coming back. That would create a serious existential threat to his regime. He's built his regime around militarization. And in fact, we also know that Putin is not one for concessions. Whenever he's forced to make concessions, he lashes out with psychopathic violence. We've seen that pattern over and over and over again. Even the perception of weakness and concessions will elicit an extremely violent response from him. So the question here is, are we missing the real trick? We're talking about this piece as if it's real, ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that Putin may not want peace, may not need peace, may not be in a place where he's at all ready for any kind of peace. He may be driving this ship until it goes down before he actually agrees to any kind of peace concession, even if nominally it looks favorable to his regime.
Well, maybe I could start off there. Lawrence Freeman was at Chatham House last week, and he made the point that Putin, can't accept a ceasefire because the war's been pretty disastrous, right? I mean, this deal is kind of interesting in terms of there's plenty of carrots in this deal for Putin, right? I mean, he gets the territories, he occupies de facto. The Americans accept the recognition of Russian control of Donbass and Crimea. Russia's welcome back into G8. It gets a significant amount of its immobilized Russian assets back. There's talk of big investment deals between the Russians and the Americans. I mean, there's a great big welcome sign put up by Trump and the US administration for Russia as part of this, right? A normalize and also the amnesty for all the war crimes that have been committed by Russia and Russians in Ukraine. And I guess Ukraine will have to give up any hope of reparations. I mean, I think that's part of this deal as well. So Putin, I'm sure, can sell this as a win back home. Remember, he controls the information narrative in Russia. And as you've alluded to there, I mean, I think Putin will still see this peace deal as kind of a base camp to further intervention against Ukraine.
Yes.
There is no way anyone who, Tatiana, I'm sure, has followed Putin's progress in office since 99, as I have, over 25 years. It's absolutely crystal clear to me and other Russia watchers that Putin will not stop here. He will sign this deal knowing that he can break it going forward, and he will wake up every morning thinking how he can destabilize and undermine Ukraine.
And Europe and NATO, let's not forget. Yeah.
He's done that for 20 years, right? The whole strategy of Russia under Putin to Ukraine over the last 20 years has been about undermining its sovereignty, security, undermining its economy, making it more dependent on Russia to secure the control again of Ukraine by Russia. The fact that those policies were kind of failing in late 2013 and then with Euromaidan in 2014 spurred Russia's annexation of Crimea, intervention in Donbass in 2014, and then ultimately the full-scale invasion in 22. That is not going to stop, right? That's the harsh reality. And I don't think the Trump administration, guys like Witkoff, they have no track record or history following Russia or Ukraine particularly. They don't understand the story, right? They don't get Putin, I don't think, ultimately. And that's the fundamental problem, right? I think Ukrainians absolutely do understand the Putin regime, and I think Europe is increasingly understanding of what Putin's about. And they do get that this is an existential battle, right, for Europe, for Ukraine. Um, so anyway, let's hope that European leaders can talk some sense into Trump, and in the end, Putin respects power, strength, force. He takes advantage of weakness, right? And I think this is a weak response from the Trump administration, and Putin will exploit that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Tetyana.
from my perspective, I think any any force of this deal on Ukraine, any insistence that Ukraine has to accept this deal or sort of a variant of this deal, would really be a tragedy for the rule of law and for the very careful system that we have here in Europe have established post World War II to promote peace and security. There is no doubt that it will be absolutely catastrophic, both for our financial security and overall security. Having Ukraine as a failed state in the middle of Europe with this sort of carrot of possible EU accession dangling there is an impossibility. It will destabilize Europe. What can Europe do? Now, I strongly believe that the next thing that Europe should be doing is pursuing its own cause and finalizing its idea of the reparation loan. What is the reparation loan? It's nothing to do with reparations. In fact, it is a loan of the cash that's currently held in Euroclear, so close to 200 billion euros, as I said, to Ukraine to fund for the next 3 years, frankly. Maybe less, but and what it needs, I would disagree with Tim. I wouldn't blame Belgium sort of for blocking this deal, because actually what Belgium needs, similarly to Ukraine, are some financial guarantees, financial and security guarantees, I would say, from the other partners, so from the rest of the EU and UK, that it will not be left alone with this possible liability on its books of 200 billion to Russia. So that's why, if this money is going to be taken and handed over to Ukraine, Belgians are quite right to insist that Europeans do offer them some sort of guarantees that this financial responsibility, should Russia wish to come back for it, will not end up with Belgium and Euroclear, because frankly, they can't afford to shoulder them. They're a tiny state. And Russia, by the way, is exploiting it. It's exploiting the fact that Belgium is a small state. There are some political unrest within Belgium, and we know how Russia operates. It will operate to destabilize Belgium. So I think this is the time when Europe really needs to stand strong and lead. We cannot start blaming each other for not pushing the reparation loan through. Everybody has to be understanding that any sort of, if you can pass on the asset, but you cannot pass on liability in law. And in order for Belgium to accept the liability, they will have to receive some sort of indemnities, financial and security guarantees. So that's what I would urge you Europe to do, and I very much hope we will have an answer on this in December.
And shirking that clear responsibility through this process is exceedingly worrying, in fact, because this should have been obvious right from the start when calls were made to use those assets, and that's a real concern. This story is going to run and run. We're going to get more and more information out. I think it will be useful to remind people of the so-called Moscow rules of negotiation, so we don't fall into the trap out of desperation. So in that respect, we're hopefully going to get Keir Giles on next week to interpret where we are next week, and hopefully more Chatham House experts and other strong voices, especially as I'll be in Kyiv next week. I want to get some strong Ukrainian voices in there as well, especially someone like Vitaly Portnikov. I'm going to try and reach out to and see if we can get a sort of view on that from the Ukrainian point of view. No doubt we'll learn more, and more information is coming up by the hour. Thank you so much for Tatiana and Timothy for joining at short notice to talk about this absolutely critical issue, as well as looping back to the other elephant in the room, which is the frozen assets, which must finally be used to benefit Ukraine's resistance against illegal aggression and evil. Let's put it like that. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, John, for having us.